morning, everyone. This morning's reading is Genesis 45, verses 1 to 15. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried out, "Send everyone away from me." So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him, so dismayed were they at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come closer to me." And they came closer. He said, "I am your brother, Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves, because you sold me here. For God has sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are 5 more years in which there will be neither ploughing nor harvest. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his house, and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Hurry and go up to my father and say to him, 'Thus says your son Joseph, God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me. Do not delay. You shall settle in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me, you and your children and your children's children, as well as all your flocks, your herds, and all that you have. I will provide for you there, since there are 5 more years of famine to come, so that you and your household and all that you have will not come to poverty. And now your eyes and the eyes of my brother Benjamin see that it is my own mouth that speaks to you. You must tell my father how greatly I am honored in Egypt, and all that you have seen. Hurry and bring my father down here." Then he fell upon his brother Benjamin's neck and wept, while Benjamin wept upon his neck. And he kissed all his brothers and wept upon them. And after that his brothers talked with him. May God add his blessing and understanding to these words. Amen.
Good morning. It's great to be here, to be with you again. It's always nice to visit the congregation and see so many familiar faces. Let us pause for a moment of prayer. Thank you, God. Thank you that we can be in this beautiful space and to be together today to worship you, to be with one another, and to offer care and support as you offer care and support to us. As we hear these words, God, may you help us to hear what you would have us to hear, so that we may live as you would have us live, and love as you would have us love. In Christ's name we pray all these things. Amen. Back in July of this year, I came to this church to attend the funeral of the Reverend Dr. Steve Weaver, and I think many of you were also here for that service. Steve was a pastor of this church for many years, and he was also the co-founder in 1979 of Pastoral Counseling Services, which is the agency that I work at in Manchester, New Hampshire, a pastoral counseling center that provides psychotherapy and consultation to people. During the service, Steve's older son, also named Stephen, gave a eulogy for his father, and I was struck as he talked about the positive influence that his father and his mother had on his Christian faith. He said, for instance, that his parents raised them to believe that God is loving and kind and compassionate, and they were always taught to bring that into your relationships with all people. He said that his father said to him, "God is compassionate, so you must be compassionate. God is kind, so you must be kind. God is forgiving, so you must be forgiving. God does not discriminate against people, so you must not discriminate. He went on to say that because of what he learned from his father and his mother, that when he and his wife moved to Orlando, he very proudly joined the Orlando Gay Men's Chorus, where he was happily welcomed as the token straight man in this chorus. Our understanding, I think, has a profound impact on how we live our lives. How we view God, how we see God, will powerfully affect how we relate to one another and how we live our lives. If we think that God is punitive, we will probably be punitive of ourselves and punitive toward others. If we believe that God is judgmental, we're likely to be harshly judgmental of ourselves and judgmental of other people. If we think that God really isn't involved in our lives, we may choose not to be very involved in the lives of our communities and in the lives of other people. If we believe that we have the one true religion and that God is on our side only, we are likely to be critical of other people and maybe even hostile of other people who have found other paths that have led them to God. However, if we believe that God is ready to forgive and gracious and kind and slow to anger, then we will aspire to bring those qualities into our relationships with one another. If we believe that God is our refuge and our strength, a very present help in times of trouble, we are likely to bring those qualities into our relationships and to strive to be those things for one another as well. If we believe that God's steadfast love was established forever and that God's faithfulness is firm, then we will be loving and faithful too. And if we believe that God calls us to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with God, then we are likely to do those things too. Our understanding of God has a very powerful impact on how we live our lives. I want to look at the Joseph story that Don so beautifully read for us this morning and look at his understanding of God as we can understand it by looking at how he interacted with his brothers. The full story of Joseph actually occurs over a period of several chapters in the book of Genesis, chapters 37 through 50. And the reading that we have today kind of plops us down near the end of that story. So I want to give you a brief summary of what happened before this point. I'm sure you know it, but I want to give you just a brief review of the story of Joseph that we have just before the reading that we heard today. So Jacob is the father of 12 sons, and according to Genesis 37, Jacob loved Joseph more than any of his other children because Joseph was the son conceived in his old age. And Jacob made Joseph a long robe with many sleeves. In a popular musical based on this story, it's called a Technicolor Dreamcoat. When his brothers saw that Jacob loved Joseph more than them, and when he gave him this coat, this beautiful coat, they began to hate him and could not speak peaceably to him. So in addition to being Jacob's favorite child and receiving from him a beautiful coat, Joseph starts to have dreams that sometimes in the future he's going to be in a position of authority and influence over his brothers. Well, this of course makes his brothers resent him even more. And this is where a sinister turn happens in the story. The brothers are so filled with hatred toward Joseph that they conspire to get rid of him. First they decide to kill him, then they change their minds, they beat him up, they throw him into a pit, and eventually they finally choose to sell him into slavery in Egypt instead. To cover up the crime, they kill a goat and they spatter the blood of the goat onto this beautiful Technicolor Dreamcoat. They take the coat back to Jacob and they tell him that Joseph has been killed by wild beasts. And Jacob, of course, suffers in an excruciating kind of manner. In Egypt, Joseph becomes a slave of a rich man named Potiphar, who's an officer of the Pharaoh. When Joseph rejects the romantic advances of Potiphar's wife, she falsely accuses him of sexual misconduct, and Joseph is thrown into prison for many years. Over time, word spreads that Joseph is good at interpreting dreams. The Pharaoh is having some difficult dreams, so he brings Joseph. Joseph correctly interprets some dreams that helps Egypt prepare for 7 years of plentiful crops and 7 years of famine. Grateful for his interpretation, the Pharaoh releases Joseph from prison and raises him to a position of influence and authority, just as his dreams had predicted, and he takes on special roles there. Well, this famine that he had predicted has indeed hit Canaan, which is where Jacob and Joseph's brothers live. And so Jacob sends the brothers to Egypt to see if they could get some food and grain there. In Egypt, the brothers meet Joseph, but they don't recognize him immediately. And that's where the lectionary passage that we heard today picks up on. So if anybody has a right to be angry and frustrated and resentful toward his siblings, it's certainly Joseph. And now, after many, many years of separation, Joseph comes face to face with these brothers who have done such terrible things to him. I think it's at this point we really get to see what kind of faith Joseph has and what kind of God Joseph believes in. Here we see that Joseph doesn't have an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth kind of faith. He doesn't seek to punish his brothers. He doesn't throw them into prison. He doesn't seek revenge. He doesn't sell them into slavery. He doesn't try to kill them. Instead, Joseph has compassion on these men. He forgives them and he urges them to forgive themselves for what they have done. He says to them, "Come near to me, I pray you. I am your brother. I am Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, because God has sent me here before you to preserve life." In Joseph's response to his brothers, we see him living out his faith in a loving and compassionate and kind and forgiving God. Implicit in Joseph's explanation of his faith is his belief that God indeed has used these painful circumstances in his life to bring out good things. Because of Joseph's ability to interpret dreams, he's been able to help Egypt through a very difficult period of time. He's risen to a significant position in the government that has allowed him to help many people. Additionally, implicit in Joseph's faith, I think, is the belief that through all that he has experienced, God has been with him in a steadfast, loving kind of way. And now he reflects that steadfast love in his compassion, in his forgiveness of his brothers, and his gracious hospitality. He invites them to go back to Egypt and bring his father and their families, basically to move in with him. And overwhelmed with emotion and gratitude that he's been reunited with his family, he weeps loudly and hugs and kisses all of his brothers. This is one of my favorite stories in the Bible because of this wonderful proclamation of a loving and kind and caring God. This passage has a lot of similarities, I think, to Jesus' parable of the prodigal son. In both stories, family members leave home. They abandon family members, they hurt them, they make mistakes, they lose their way. But in both stories, the family members come back, they're reunited. Both of these stories, I think, point to a God who indeed is loving and kind and gracious, and who welcomes us back with open arms, no matter what things we have done and what mistakes we have made in our lives. Despite the traumas that Joseph has experienced, being beaten up, being thrown into a pit, being thrown into slavery, being falsely accused of things he didn't do, he's learned and experienced that God is a present God, God is a benevolent God, God is a forgiving God, and this faith has sustained him through all these years of suffering and brought him to this new place, this new beginning with his family. I think it was probably this same kind of faith, this faith in a steadfast, kind and loving God that sustained Nelson Mandela when he was imprisoned for 27 years in South Africa. Nelson Mandela has said, people are taught to hate, but if they can learn to hate, they can learn to love. I think it was this same faith that sustained Mother Teresa, who for many years worked with the poor and the suffering in Calcutta, India. And Mother Teresa has said, wherever God has put you, that is your vocation. It is not what we do, but how much love we put into what we do. I think it's love that changes people. It was the love of God that helped sustain Joseph. It was the love of God, I believe, that sustained Nelson Mandela, that sustained Mother Teresa. I think anytime love shows up in our lives, that's where God is showing up. Reminds me a little bit of this story that we probably heard about also this summer, where a family was vacationing in Florida and they were swimming, and a large riptide carried them out into the water. And in response, 80 to 100 people formed a human chain, reached out, stretched out to these people who had been caught into this terrible riptide, and saved and rescued these people. So anytime we see people acting justly and kindly and compassionately, I think that's the love of God showing up in our lives. And it's that kind of love that can change us and transforms us. One of my favorite theologians is the 13th century mystic Meister Eckhart. And he wrote a poem that I really like a lot called Love Does That. And I want to share his poem with you. He says this: all day long a little burro labors, sometimes with heavy loads on her back, and sometimes just with worries that bother only burros. And worries, as we know, can be more exhausting than physical labor. Once in a while, a kind monk comes to her stable and brings a pear. But more than that, he looks into the burro's eyes and touches her ears, and for a few seconds the burro is free and even seems to laugh, because love does that. Love frees. I think that's exactly what the love of God does. It frees us to be loving and kind and compassionate toward others as well. So what does that mean for us as a congregation or as a church? I think it reminds us that we have a responsibility to proclaim images of God as loving and kind to the world around us. Many people have grown up with images of God as being judgmental and unkind and critical, and those lives have been hurt so terribly. So we need to proclaim in the songs we sing, in the sermons we preach, as we teach our Sunday school children, in the prayers we pray, in the social justice that we do, in our collection of food and clothing for the community, as the kids did today. We're proclaiming that God is a loving God, and God is a compassionate God who wants us to reach out to other people. And that is our duty, that's our responsibility as a faithful community of followers of Jesus. When I officiate at weddings at the Old South Church in Boston, which is where Sue and I met many years ago, I like to remind people of the steadfast and compassionate love of God when I officiate at the ring exchange that's part of weddings. And so when they're about to exchange the rings, I tell the couple, these rings are really important symbols for you. They're significant reminders for you of two things. First of all, because they are circular, they're reminders of your unending love for one another. And secondly, they're also reminders of God's unending love for you as well. And then I usually tell the couple that no matter where you are, whether you're watching TV together, whether you're out to dinner, you're out to a movie, or whether you're separated by many miles, you can look at these rings, these symbols of your love, and be reminded that you are loved by a wonderful partner and you are loved by a wonderful God. I think that's the God that Joseph came to believe in spite of the hurt, the betrayal, the disappointments he faced. He trusted that God's steadfast love sustained him and guided him in all of his experiences. That's the kind of love that Jesus taught us about. And it's the kind of love that you and I are called to share in our lives as disciples too. And so I close with these words from a song by Fred Kahn, who says this. He says, "Help us accept each other as Christ accepted us. Teach us as sister, brother, each person to embrace. Be present, God, among us, and bring us to believe we are ourselves accepted and meant to live and love. May God help us in all these things. Amen."
Concerns or prayers for the congregation. For Barbara? For Barbara. For Jason. Charlie. Let us pray together. Loving and gracious God, we come to you together to offer up our prayers. We especially offer up prayers this day for those in uniform, those past and present, those who seek peace and pursue it. We pray for the multitude of people who have given themselves to a cause greater than themselves, those who have risked their lives for someone else. Lord God, we thank you for this opportunity today to give you thanks and to be together. We ask you to continue to watch over all who are serving overseas, all who are struggling in mind, body, and soul, and all those in our community. We ask you to continue to look out for those who are in mourning, those who are sick, those who are in pain. Most of all, we ask you to be with us, now and always. Amen. And we continue with our Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our sins, as we forgive those who sin against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. And at this time, I would like to invite folks forward to help with the offering, and invite those in the congregation to give what seems like the best way to give and help right now as a way of giving